Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really mind-bending. We're looking at a truly fascinating source text titled The Architecture of the Eighth Day. Now, whether you're deeply familiar with theological frameworks or you're just a curious learner, this text is totally captivating. It lays out a mathematically precise, cosmic blueprint for universal restoration. It basically asks us to look at ancient scriptures through this incredibly unique lens of structural timelines and agricultural science. And remember, we're just here to objectively unpack the architecture of these ideas as presented in the source. We're exploring this grand narrative of how the cosmos might just be hardwired for ultimate reconciliation. Okay, let's dive into this. The source immediately sets up what is basically a historic theological paradox. It calls it a massive blind spot. So on one hand, we have the concept of God's universal love, portraying him as the savior of absolutely everyone, right? But then, in sharp contrast, we have the traditional doctrine of election, which is the idea of salvation being exclusively reserved for a chosen few. Historically, people kind of try to resolve this tension in one of two ways. They either limit God's love, saying, well, he only intends to save a few, or they limit his power, arguing that he wants to save all, but is somehow thwarted. But the text asks a brilliant question. What if both sides are actually true, but we've just completely misunderstood how they fit together? To see how the text resolves this puzzle, we're going to unroll this grand blueprint step by step. It's going to be quite the cinematic journey. First, we'll hit the theological blind spot. Second, the blueprint of the 7 ages. Third, election as a conduit. Fourth, the science of the harvest. Fifth, the dual calendar redemption. And finally, we'll arrive at the dawn of the 8th day.
All right, part 1. The theological blind spot. Let's look a little closer at the solution the text offers to this deep historical conflict. According to the text, the scriptural solution to our paradox is a concept known as evangelical universalism. And the key takeaway here, the absolute game changer, is a radical redefinition of election. In this cosmic model, election is a methodology. It is not a final destination. God doesn't just save a few so he can exclude the many. Instead, the framework argues that he saves a few first to serve as a conduit, a channel, to eventually save everyone. It totally shifts the biblical narrative from a story of exclusive rescue into this flawless, overarching blueprint of universal restoration. But, to really grasp how this works, we have to look at the timeline.
Which brings us to part 2, Blueprint of the 7 Ages. Let's map out the structural chronology of this cosmic plan.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ancient Judeo-Christian template of history, the 7,000-year creation week. It's built on that well-known biblical principle from 2 Peter that one day is as 1,000 years. So the text structures history into these distinct ages. First up, you have the 6 days of labor. That's 6,000 years where humanity operates under the total futility of self-governance. And this leads directly into the 7th day, the 7th millennium. This is a Sabbath rest, a messianic era of restorative governance. But here's the catch. That is still within the temporal world. The ultimate destination, the real finish line, is the 8th day. That is the new heavens and new earth. It marks the complete dissolution of the old nature and the actual dawn of resurrected eternity.
And this highlights a truly fascinating mathematical anomaly that the text points out in Genesis chapter 5. Let's talk about the figure of Enoch. Now, if you count generationally from Adam, Enoch is the 7th generation. He represents the absolute pinnacle of the old creation, right? Achieving this perfect walk with God. But if you look closely and count the physical names on the ledger, Enoch is actually the 8th name. He literally stands at the exact mathematical intersection of the 7 and the 8. And because Enoch was translated, meaning he didn't die, the author argues he serves as living proof that mankind cannot just be improved or patched up. Humanity must be radically translated and resurrected into the 8th day. So, moving right along to part 3, election as a conduit. How do specific individuals fit into this massive cosmic structure? Well, if Enoch is the destination, the text argues that Adam's son Seth is the vehicle to get us there. Seth's Hebrew name literally translates to appointed or set in place. The author points out that this is literally the exact biblical definition of the elect. Seth represents the original remnant. He's the sovereignly appointed seed inserted right into a hostile world. And his lineage acts as a corporate arc of faith with one primary, laser-focused purpose: to deliver the deliverer. Seth's line delivers Noah, whose name means rest, to preserve humanity. And ultimately, that same line delivers Jesus to conquer sin. It's like God chose one line specifically as the mechanism to save everyone else. The text notes that mistaking that conduit for the final goal, that's been a massive historical error.
It points straight to 1 Timothy 4:10, which actually calls God the Savior of all people, especially of believers. See, the distinction there is all about timing and function. Believers are saved especially today so they can function as a royal priesthood. And what do priests do? They exist to stand in the gap for others. Therefore, the elect are a hypotyposin, which is a Greek term for a preliminary sketch or a prototype. What you should really take away from this is that the unrepentant world isn't viewed as eternally damned in this model. They are simply the not yet saved. The deliverance of the elect is basically the legal living promise that the rest are absolutely gonna follow.
All right, part 4, the science of the harvest. Because this framework isn't just abstract, high-in-the-clouds theology, it's grounded in observable, highly logical agricultural metaphors. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how a harvest creates a perfect micro-narrative of processing. It doesn't all happen in a single afternoon, right? It's a seasonal progression. Look at the barley first. It matures early, it represents the church, and it's soft. It doesn't require any crushing. It just needs a gentle wind, representing the Ruach, the Spirit of God, to separate the chaff. Next up is the wheat, representing national Israel. It matures a bit later, and it's tougher, so it requires the actual mechanical processing of the threshing floor to extract the good stuff. And finally, you have the massive late autumn vintage, grapes and olives, representing the remaining nations. Now, these have no chaff, so where do they go? They go to the wine press. They are structurally crushed under immense pressure over the ages. But remember, the purpose of a wine press is never, ever destruction. It is extraction. It's designed to yield the new wine of joy and the oil of healing. The text explicitly uses this great analogy of a Bashushka doll to explain all of this. Biblical prophecy is fractal. It's telescoping. So, step 1, the Old Testament historical fulfillments are totally genuine, but they are just shadows opening up to step 2, which are the spiritual fulfillments of the New Testament. But wait, even those are just the already acting as shadows for step 3, the massive universal realities of the age to come. And this loop just keeps repeating, telescoping out, until all ages are completely fulfilled and we reach the ultimate telos, or the final end goal where we aren't bound by these cycles at all anymore. On to part 5, the dual calendar redemption. So, legally speaking, how did Jesus actually time his crucifixion to secure this incredibly complex harvest? Well, back in the 1st century, Israel was deeply divided by 2 totally different temporal systems. You had the Essene solar calendar, which calculated a 364-day cycle where Passover always fell on a Tuesday evening. This was the famous upper room meal of bread and wine. And by the way, it's exactly why Jesus told his disciples to look for a man carrying a water pitcher. That was a specific Essene gender role signal, because in mainstream Pharisaic culture, only women carried water. In sharp contrast, the Pharisaic lunar calendar, which was followed by the mainstream temple, required the Passover lamb to be sacrificed on Friday. Here is where the math gets just absolutely incredible. The source argues that Jesus legally bound himself to both of these temporal factions. By eating the Essene solar meal on Tuesday night, and then being crucified on Wednesday, which happened to be the exact preparation day for the lunar Passover lamb, he legally secured both the Sons of Light and the mainstream establishment. This perfect dual timeline gives us exactly 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. He perfectly fulfills the legal requirements of both groups before securing them both together in his resurrection on Sunday morning. Just brilliant. And that brings us to our final section, part 6, Dawn of the 8th Day. All of this structural processing, all of these ages, and all of this flawless legal timing, it all leads us to this one awe-inspiring climax. Let's move to Bonal and see how this builds, drawing straight from 1 Corinthians 15. The text describes humanity essentially marching out of death in successive military ranks. First, the elect firstfruits are resurrected right at the end of the 6th age. Then the nations are processed through the 7th age. Ultimately, the Great White Throne acts as the final, ultimate pressing floor. Death itself is literally thrown into the fire and completely swallowed up in victory. The recursive scaffolding of the ages is totally torn down, and the Adamic nature is fully, completely dissolved across all of humanity. The 8th day dawns. So, the crucial point is that this dawn triggers a stunning cosmic shift. It's a farewell to kings. The text suggests that the title King of Kings actually belongs specifically to the 7th age. That's an era of enforcement, hierarchy, and correction, which is necessitated by the gap between what is holy and what is broken. But once the 8th day finally arrives, the seed has officially become the fruit. External governance becomes completely obsolete. The whole king-to-subject dynamic is dissolved, and it's replaced by a pure, unmediated father-to-child family reality.
The source views this specific verse from Paul as the grand closing of the great loop of creation. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected, that God may be all in all. Having executed all the heavy processing of the ages to redeem every last seed in the field, the Son doesn't just stubbornly cling to the throne of enforcement. He abdicates. He hands the fully matured, fully restored family of mankind right back over to God the Father. The hierarchy of the ages just dissolves, and God is finally, as the text heavily emphasizes, all in all.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought from the text. Think about this. If God is the infinite prime mover, maybe the ultimate telos isn't just some static, boring finish line. What if the eighth day is simply the beginning of an infinite, recursive expansion of glorification? It's a really compelling paradigm. It asks us to wonder, is God not just the end of the journey, but actually the perpetual beginning of every new horizon? I will leave you to chew on that one. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this incredible architectural blueprint. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.